As far as I know, the Easter Bunny, the Good Fairy, and Santa Claus have all been resurrected under this administration. So I think that's a perfectly viable statement. He cannot bring himself to publicly admit that his attempt to gain control of the Persian Gulf has failed. It's not going to happen anytime soon. And for all the talk about what's getting through, the equivalent of maybe one ship a day slips through, if that. The Saudis, all the Emirates, the various statelets, and now increasingly Israel, I might add, all privately know we can't protect them. If you follow his line of reasoning to the inevitable endpoint that we're talking about, you have a resumption of conflict with Iran, that they're quite prepared to destroy all of the oil infrastructure along with the various desalination plants on the western side of the Persian Gulf. That would be catastrophic. For intents and purposes, we had no army. The army is a shadow of its former self. We can't possibly fight two at once. We're barely able to fight one. This may be the straw that finally breaks the camel's back.
Yeah.
This thing called Iran. And I think you're right. And I don't see how he avoids another collision.
Today, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who, of course, is a defense and foreign policy analyst, former advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and highly decorated combat veteran. Doug, as always, welcome back to our show.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you showed the Trump Peninsula without putting the name Trump there.
It still says Gulf of Oman and Persian Gulf. I'm surprised it didn't say the Trump Gulf because, I don't know. I guess he's already had the Gulf of America.
Well, if you look at the Trump Peninsula, it does look as though it's directed into some sort of large geographical angle cavity.
Well, there is that. I hadn't looked at it from that direction. Apparently, Gary likes that. Not the way I thought this show was going to start, I have to say.
Well, I think that's about what it amounts to right now for President Trump.
Yeah, and we'll see who's on the receiving end of those kind of things. But it doesn't look like President Trump is really aware of just how much danger I think that we're in right now. Let's see is that your understanding?
As far as I know, the Easter Bunny, the Good Fairy, and Santa Claus have all been resurrected under this administration. So I think that's a perfectly viable statement.
Well, apparently there's some who are more skeptical. And
well, look, we know that right now the diesel has already begun to hit in Europe. And the Europeans, in order to move food and water and fuel and everything of criticality to human life, is much more important to diesel than anything else. In other words, without the diesel in Europe, you're at a virtual standstill. I think we can comfortably say something that, I've talked about in the past, but I think now is becoming very acute. I think we're on the verge of an explosion in Europe, particularly in Germany, to a lesser extent, Austria and Northern Italy, certainly in France and Great Britain. No diesel means serious state of emergency. And, again, what's astonishing to me is that only now people are beginning to finally wake up to the fact that in addition to diesel and jet fuel, and jet fuel, of course, is going through the roof, and we continue to try and suppress that price with whatever we have in stock. The truth is that 40% of your sulfur comes out of the Middle East, and sulfur is critical to a whole range of mining operations, refining, and all of this is going to come down like a ton of rocks on Europe first and on us as well. And I don't know how the Trump administration is going to weather it. I mean, suddenly the stipendiums that are being paid to everybody in the House and in the Senate by the Israeli and their Jewish Zionist agents in the United States may not turn out to be enough to ensure that they do not wake up and suddenly demand change.
And look, I mean, that wake up is going to come here by force, again, piercing through the nonsense and the noise and look, I think we have to be honest about acknowledging this in all seriousness. When Trump talk about this, that's where it gets even more concerning, which he did yesterday from the Oval Office. Okay, first of all, the oil price actually is not coming down. And this week, it's actually been going up. And we'll see how far it goes because he's really good at manipulating the paper price of that oil. But as you say, it's starting to actually impinge on economic activity across the range here. But he seems to think Yeah, it's no problem. I think it's a great deal. I'll just take it and declare it. This is our territory, but of course that means nothing. It literally means nothing here. And the Iranian side, which we're going to get to in a second, has different views on that. But if that's his belief, Doug, what does that tell you about the prospect that this can get resolved in any way in the near-term future without more military affairs?
Well, distinguishing delusional statements and thinking from belief is difficult. I don't know how much he actually believes and how much he says because he wants it to be true, and he thinks that miraculously between the time he says it and some point in the future it could be made real. I mean, I just don't know. I think the world, if you look at Trump as a radio, I think the world, most of it, has largely turned him off. No one pays that much attention to anything he says. A friend of mine just came back from upstate New York, where he's from, and he spent a lot of time up there, Utica and north, all the way up to the Canadian border, traveling around, seeing friends. And he said no one up there is even remotely interested in anything in the Iranian conflict. He said most of them don't pay much attention to it, but they are paying attention to the rises in fuel prices, the changes in the price of food. I think at some point there's going to be a collision with reality for him, but it's not going to come in the way he thinks. It's not going to be a magical transformation of the Persian Gulf into a little lake that we call, his personal pond, and everyone is operating freely. I think it's going to come in the form of rising prices and real anger here at home as well as overseas.
Now, you mentioned real anger. Also related to this, some information coming out here in about the last 24 hours or so, where the Iranian side has said that they have been working with the Omani side on coming up with a new map, I guess, of how the flows will go out. They say that's distinct from whether there's going to be tolls or not, or getting it reopened, but it's like you're going to say, here's where the traffic will go. We have been putting a lot of pressure on Oman and to not have anything to do with the Iranian side, not to make any kind of an agreement, et cetera. And so much so that yesterday President Trump said, "I will bomb the S out of Oman if they don't get out of the way or so." What do you make of his public claim about actually bombing one of our friends in the region?
Well, it's an innovative form of foreign policy that I think is going to produce catastrophe. It already has. It's only going to get worse from here. It's not that people don't believe him. I think people are eminently concerned about his capacity for stupid actions and dangerous outcomes. So I'm sure in Oman, the Muscat of Oman is very concerned about the whole thing. Problem is there's not a lot he can do about it. What he can do is realize that at some point we're going to fall apart and leave, but he's still going to live next door to Persia or Iran. And I think that's what most people finally conclude. We can come and go. We sail in, we sail out. We fly in, we fly out. But this enormous power called Persia and Iran, which has always loomed large in that region, is now the de facto major regional power. And so if he has to sustain some bombing damage and get along ultimately long-term with his neighbor, I think he's going to get along long-term with his neighbor. In the meantime, that's just going to add more fuel to the fire against us. The Saudis, all the Emirates, the various statelets, and now increasingly Israel, I might add, all privately know we can't protect them. I think that's a very important recognition.
And even aside from the very painful fact that we can't protect any of the sultanates or our own bases for that matter, two questions. First of all, do you think that this is just rhetoric, that Trump would never actually do that? Or is there a possibility that he could potentially bomb Oman if they don't come to the, quote, right decision?
Oh, I would not dismiss out of hand anything that he says when it comes to the use of force. We've already seen plenty of evidence for that. He says, I'm going to hit this, that, or the next thing, and eventually we get around to it and we do that. So I think his threats have to be taken very seriously. And at this point, what else has he really got? I mean, that's what we have to keep in mind. What else does he have in his so-called toolbox? what incentives are there for anybody in the region to cooperate with us, to work with us towards some sort of viable end, when we've demonstrated that the only acceptable outcome, as he puts it, is abject surrender, right? You've got to surrender to me, otherwise nothing's there, which means that Iran is targeted or scheduled for total destruction. The Iranians know that, which is why the Iranians are paying no attention to anything he says. They are simply doing what they did for years, which is preparing for the worst. And they are still preparing for the worst, only now I think they're going to take the offensive. We can talk a little bit about that if you want.
Yes, I do. But before we get into that, though, in the event that that does happen, and we do strike Oman, who's obviously been a friend of the United States for decades, if not centuries, a lot of it goes back even into the 1800s, late 1800s. What would that do to our relationship with the other Gulf Arab nations? I mean, with Kuwait, with UAE, with Qatar, with Saudi Arabia. If they see that we're willing to bond them when they don't do what they're told, what would that do to their relationship? Would that cause them to fall more in line, or would that cause them to actually also want to rupture our relationship?
Well, if we look at Saudi Arabia, I think they've already figured it out. And the Saudis know that there's no long-term future based on any kind of friendship. And, this business of talking about friends and enemies, but people fail to understand, and a large part of this is because of Trump. Trump talks about everything as though it's a personal matter for him. Oh, I am friends with Mohammed bin Salman. I am good friends with so-and-so. And I have a great relationship with so. All that's crap. It's all irrelevant, has never meant anything, never will mean anything. What counts are interests. And right now, the Saudi interest is probably to cut a new arrangement with other powers that can offer it what we cannot. Now, who are they? Well, you're looking at the Turks and the Pakistanis, two Sunni Muslim powers. Neither of those powers have much in the way of oil, and both of them are a little cash poor. What does Saudi Arabia have? It's got cash and a lot of oil. So I think the Saudis are already demonstrating conclusively that as far as they're concerned, we are not a reliable partner. I also think that they're taking a lot of heat for having essentially played the poodle for Israel. And that's over. The UAE is taking its own position on all of these things, and they're shipping cash and gold to Iran to persuade the Iranians to leave them alone and not destroy what they own. Obviously, but Kuwait is already on the agenda for dissolution. Remember, the Iranians go back to our war in which we quote unquote liberated Kuwait from Iraqi occupation, and their view is that Iraq, which is now an ally of Iran, should control Kuwait in any case, and I think we're going to see that happen. I mean, these are all things that are in this giant cauldron that is bubbling with a great deal of unhappy people in it. We're just in this process. So I think you're right. I think President Trump is becoming more desperate with each passing day, and he cannot bring himself to publicly admit that his attempt to gain control of the Persian Gulf has failed. It's not going to happen anytime soon. And for all the talk about what's getting through, the equivalent of maybe one ship a day slips through, if that.
But if you listen to Jared Kushner, he seems to think there are talks going on. Yeah, something that makes sense for us. Yeah, no kidding. We had a deal, Doug, which is called the Memorandum of Understanding, that was supposed to lead to an end of war negotiations on all kinds of fronts, and we blew that up within days of signing it. So whether we're talking to them, whether we're not, whether there's intermediaries, there is nothing, there's no reason, there's no logic that they would ever agree to anything now. So if that's the case, then why are we even bothering to have this fiction that we're talking to anybody? And if we're not going to go back to a war to solve this, which we can't because we don't have the assets or the defensive, they have the defensive capability to resist it, where is this going as far as Trump is concerned?
Well, I think it's very important to listen to Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner is kind of a double agent. On the one hand, he is Mr. Netanyahu's personal liaison with President Trump and effectively the United States government. So whatever he says should be taken seriously because you're listening to the preferences, in fact, I would argue the demands of Mr. Netanyahu. It's just as you've got to listen to someone like Ben Gvir, who is the equivalent of the director of the FBI inside Israel, and take very seriously what he says. And he's been making comments along the lines of we should kill 40 or 50 of the residents of Gaza every night or something because they're not people. They're not human. We just need to continue this day after day after day. Again, you've got to take him seriously because he's speaking for Mr. Netanyahu in a domestic sense. And that also has international implications. But there's something else. Kushner has incredibly unprecedented access to the president of the United States. And I think it's more than just access. I think he, frankly, wields enormous influence over the president and, as a result, over the United States, determines what is important and what is not. So I have some bad news for everyone. If you follow his line of reasoning to the inevitable endpoint that we're talking about, you have a resumption of conflict with Iran. In the meantime, you get this naval blockade. And one wonders what the naval blockade is doing other than making the world miserable because, as you just pointed out, a ship gets out about every day. It's usually filled to the brim with oil and it goes to China. If it doesn't go to China, it goes to India. Ultimately, the Koreans and the Japanese need it desperately, so they're trying to get it as well. But that has nothing to do with us. What we're trying to do is fulfill Mr. Trump's personal obligations to Greater Israel. And that's where we are. And so I don't see how you get Greater Israel, which I think is another illusion anyway, but I don't see how you get it unless you get the United States Armed Forces back into the fight against Iran. Not that that will guarantee success, but that's the best that the Israeli state and its agents here in the United States like Kushner could hope for.
Well, I know somebody who is listening to Kushner, and that is the Iranian side. They're also listening to Trump when he talks about taking over the Strait of Hormuz, when he talks about in the past about annihilating their civilization. They've been paying a lot of attention to that. And I think it was actually earlier today, Ghalibaf went on Iranian television and said, about the release in the Strait of Hormuz. So now he's saying, look, what the deal that we had on June 17th, about a couple things that had to be up front, but then the strait gets open first. They said, now that's off the table. Now then, if you want a diplomatic settlement, you have to give us the release of the funds. You have to give us the sanctions relief. You have to end the war in Lebanon, and that means Israel withdrawing from their perspective. And then you have to completely open your blockade and move all your troops out, which, of course, Trump is never going to do any of those things. So, I mean, it's an obvious question, I suppose, but where does that leave us?
Well, I think it's important to understand that having killed the initial generation of leaders early in the campaign, we now have people that are in charge who are infinitely more determined. Not that the last group wasn't, but now their view is there is no point in talking to Trump or anybody else from Washington. In fact, in Tehran, they've concluded you might as well just open direct talks with Netanyahu because he's ultimately in control. And clearly that's not going to happen. So it's back to your original question. What kind of course are we on? We're on a collision course. It's a collision course with reality, which reality dictates more war. Now, at some point, it all collapses because we can't keep it up. Now, we've already seen problems in the Navy. Now, how severe they are, how many problems they've had aboard ship, that's a matter for speculation. We can't know without being there. And there are various reports that conflict with each other. But we can't imagine that if you keep people at sea for almost, 10 months, 290 days, that they're going to be miserable. Gee, what a shocker. But there's something else going on. And this goes to your comment about what can we do. We have serious problems with logistics. You'll remember when this whole thing started, one of our discussion points was Iran is fighting on its doorstep, much like Russia is fighting on its doorstep. Well, that's an enormous advantage that we don't have. We have to ship everything 6,000 miles. And we have very few ports in the area that are really open to us for any length of time. because we're not terribly popular. We're seen as the problem, as the source of the war. Now, if you don't have very many ports that you can go to, then you turn to naval resupply. Well, naval resupply has changed over many decades. We've cut back on the numbers of ships. In fact, I don't know that we have any right now that are manned by Navy sailors that reprovision ships. What we used to do is you had a fleet of commercial vessels that would come out to a certain point. Then U.S. Navy resupply ships that were actually armed would take over and they would complete the delivery process. We don't do that anymore, and it's a much more problematic and dangerous situation. And then finally, we don't have the depth in the force. When we operated back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even in the early 90s, we still had well over 300, 400 ships. Not anymore. We have, I think the latest count was 189 ships in the active or regular Navy. I don't know what we have beyond that in terms of support, but it's a shadow of what it once was. So we're in a very difficult position. Otherwise, there would not be this tremendous emphasis right now behind the scenes on preparing every B-52, every B-1, every B-2 for operations against Iran, because they can fly these vast distances. And that's why we have sent more and more refueling assets into the region. We're running this, I don't want to say, but certainly, it's on a very fragile basis logistically.
And even on top of the logistics, I mean, the question comes in, what can you do? And I'm going to get into some of the statements that have been coming out just in some Western media and other statements that have been coming out of Tehran, which indicate that we're about to find out what we can do militarily. But let's look at what President Trump said, I think it was yesterday or day before, that answering the question about the ammunition stockpiles, about the JASSMs, about the Tomahawks, the PRSMs, and other things for ATACMs, for example. He says, you know what? Yeah, we don't have as many of those as we want, but what we've used so far is peanuts. We've got all the ammunition we will ever need to go back and do whatever we need to do. Isn't that true?
Well, we can carpet bomb. That means that every B-52, for instance, that you send over the target area carries 90 500-pound bombs. And you can fly these in formation. And you're not going to hit with great precision, but whatever happens to be under those falling bombs is ultimately going to be destroyed. Now, have we done this? Yes, of course we've done it. We did it in Vietnam. And did it work? Sometimes they called these arc light strikes, these massive B-52 strikes would come in. We got started down that road during the Second World War, and in Normandy, for days, we flew over a very small area, hundreds of aircraft with thousands and tons of these bombs that opened up the German defensive line long enough for us to get through it in great numbers. What are we going to do with that in Iran? I mean, about the only thing that you can do with any certainty is hit cities. So now you're back to doing what we did to the Germans and to the Japanese. I don't know very many people who are completely convinced that that won the war. Certainly didn't win the war against Germany, but it certainly paved the road for the advance of the Soviet armies into Central Europe. That it did. When you go to Japan, we certainly killed large numbers of people, but we think in retrospect, the submarine offensive, which isolated the Japanese home islands, was reducing everybody to feeding on rats. So I'm not a big advocate for going in and carpet bombing Iranian cities thinking that that's going to help. I don't think it will. So then you go to the next step. Well, if that's not the answer, why don't we do the Elbridge-Colby thing? Elbridge-Colby's been running around Washington for some time now. In addition to preaching war against China, he also likes to talk about tactical nuclear weapons. And we've talked about this before. My view is I agree with Colin Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It said, oh, yes, if we use a couple of tactical nuclear weapons, this is back in the 90s. Oh, I'm sure the Soviets will look at this. Oh, well, that's just a small nuke. We don't need to become too excited over that. And of course, his point was obvious. What are you, stupid? If you use a tactical nuclear weapon, the incentive exists for the opposing side to use everything they can. Now, I don't know what the Iranians have. I have no idea. But this also then raises the question, depending upon how much damage you do, does this then precipitate something everybody's been talking about, which is the August 1914 scenario, where suddenly China and Russia both enter into the fray. That could happen. I hope not. I don't think they want to. I don't see any evidence that that's their preference. But I don't think they're going to stand by and allow us to completely obliterate or incinerate Iran. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but that's the best I can do.
Well, and unfortunately, that's going to have to, that well may be about to move from the hypothetical theoretical realm into the, no, you have to make a decision here pretty quick. Let me just, MOU was just an attempt to get some oil out, to relieve the pressure on the price of oil, and then build up for a bigger strike. So they believe, and I have confirmed this through one source that I have in Tehran, that is what they believe. And the implication being they well may start the next round, not wait to be hit. What do you think?
This goes back to the earlier point that we were making about the people that are in charge in Tehran. These are people who are radically different from the people who were in charge just 90 or 180 days ago. They harbor no illusions, and they see a lot of evidence that we continue to move weapons and equipment and supplies into the region. They see a carrier leaves and they see another carrier shows up. So what are they supposed to conclude? They're concluding exactly what you described. So the next question is, if they're going to move to an offensive posture, what does that look like? Well, one thing they've made abundantly clear is that they're quite prepared to destroy all of the oil infrastructure along with the various desalination plants on the western side of the Persian Gulf. That would be catastrophic. That would be the end of Saudi Arabia and, frankly, most of the population that lives there. I think we said there were 40 to 60 million people, somewhere like that, from Iraq all the way down to the UAE's border with Oman. That doesn't appear to be the case any longer. I don't know what the actual numbers are now, but a large number of people have very wisely left the region. So I guess in that sense, it would be fewer human losses, but still, that's one thing they can do. The other question, and we can't answer this very easily, is how far can they reach out and touch us at sea? Now, the U.S. Navy and the people running it have an understanding of those limitations, and they've been cautious. They've moved their assets much further away from shore than they have in a long time. We can't afford to lose these big capital ships. They cannot be easily replaced. We just went through the discussion of, you've got less than 189 ships now, and of that number, what is it, a third or more are actually committed to this operation in the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. We don't have 300 or 400 ships anymore, so we're unlikely to take very many risks in that regard. But can the Iranians have an impact? Can they reach out and touch us? I think we saw in one of the attacks that was aimed at Diego Garcia that they've been working on that capability. So I don't think that's an impossibility. And I guess you could reach out beyond the Middle East. There are other areas where we could be struck and hit and harmed and hurt. I don't think they'll come to the continental United States, but given the state of affairs down in Mexico and the chaos down there, that's always been our strategic soft underbelly. Wouldn't be very difficult. Organized crime and terrorism go hand in hand. They could do things in Mexico that could harm us in the Southwest. We don't know. And I don't have access to any of the sensitive intelligence that would give us a real.
You know, President Trump often says, you know, we have literally unlimited amounts of ammunition, et cetera, to face this. We also like to be the ones that initiate everything. We decide when something's going to happen. We decide how big it's going to happen, et cetera. But what happens if Iran decides to take the initiative and then now we have to react? We had this from Vice President Vance a couple of days ago, talking about the tools that he says that we have. Do the tools he mentions here, are they sufficient to react to something if the Iranian side takes the next move? Does he have a lot of tools? I mean, what tools do we have to react to that kind? If Iran does what you hits that target list that you were talking about there, what tools do we have to react to that?
Well, I know that we're keeping roughly 32% of the profit of the oil that is sold that comes out of Venezuela, which is a very high percentage. It's actually higher than the sort of reparations that we insisted the Germans pay after World War I. At that point, we and the Allies were taking 13% of whatever the Germans exported. So that's kind of an interesting comparison: 13% after World War I and 32% today. And the argument was, well, we're using that to pay for the initial operation that captured Maduro and his wife. But obviously, it goes far beyond that. I don't know what other things he's talking about. If we're talking about more sanctions, more bullying, more pressure in that regard, I don't think those things can have the desired effect. I think whatever happens in that department is going to be either shrugged off or defeated. And it'll be defeated with the help of other countries increasingly aligning with Iran. And that's one of the things that I don't think we realize. We're beginning to see the gradual arming and weaponization of what I would call the BRICS alliance. It started out as simply a giant trade union. In other words, an operation to build an alternative to our financial system, which we exploit and employ to bully people to get them to do what we want. How do you get out from under it? Well, you leave it. And you operate entirely in this new China-centric financial system that is emerging around BRICS. So I think those things are underway. And some people call that de-dollarization. I think that's underway. What I guess I'm driving at is we've done an enormous amount of damage to ourselves. I don't see any evidence that anything we do at this point against Iran is going to be good for the United States, the American people, and our long-term strategic interests. But I don't think there is any long-term strategy. I don't think we've ever had a long-term strategy. The only one we can point to in recent years is obviously containment within the last several decades, and that's gone by the wayside. So this is a very short-sighted operation with very short-term interests. The interest to annihilate Iran, make them, surrender, if you will, to Donald Trump. Good luck. Don't think
okay, so let me ask you a hard question here. Again, if Iran does take the initiative here, and if they start a sequence that spawns a response by the United States kinetic, and then that they take that as I guess taking the gloves off, and they hit all those targets you mentioned, which is gonna, I don't think it can have any effect other than have a catastrophic economic impact, major recession, possibly depression on the United States, which is going to cause us a great deal of problems throughout the world. What is the possibility or the implications, maybe even better way to put it, for Iran to calculate, hey, listen, we can start a next round here that will definitely have a response, and they'll hit our oil infrastructure, they'll hit our energy, and it'll be very, very painful and a long time to fix. But that could ultimately cause the defeat of the United States, and our long-term objectives may be met. Is that a calculation that they could rationally choose?
I think it is. And I think that you're talking about damage done to the Persian Gulf region and its infrastructure that would require at least 10 years to recover. So you're talking about a definite global level depression, and I think we're well on our way in that direction at this point as well. One of the things that's kind of interesting is to watch Scott Bessent, and he's very sensitive. We're now way over 5% in the 30-year bonds. This last bond sale was enormously expensive for us. We're in a lot of trouble financially, and Scott Bessent is using every conceivable trick and illusion that he has in his bag to sort of postpone the inevitable financial collapse that I think is coming. I've always looked at, because I have great confidence and trust in what Jeffrey Goodluck and Luke Groen and others talk about. I also look at this 5% barrier on the 10-year bond, and everybody makes it very clear if you break that and you go over 5% yield on the 10-year bond, you're uncharted territory, and that could be catastrophic for us.
You see we're getting close to that now.
This is the end of the petrodollar system, which is, frankly, at this stage, dead anyway, which just recycled dollars from the Persian Gulf back into the United States. That's gone. You don't find anybody wants to invest in our debt. We sort of postponed a collapse in Japan, but doing so harmed the euro, because we used the euro, of course, as a banker said to me the other day in Europe. He said, "Who are we kidding? The euro and the dollar are the same thing. It's all dollars." I said, "Oh, okay." I think we're in a very fragile set of conditions right now financially.
So let me ask you this:
I guess I don't know which one breaks first, Dan. Does it break here at home financially first, or does it blow up in the Gulf and then break here financially? I don't know.
Yeah, but it's just a matter of maybe the sequence, not whether. In the event that happens, let's just kind of put this in the context of the world that we're heading into. So by all accounts, there's going to be a bloodbath come November. We're now less than 90 days out to that. And the likelihood is that the next Congress that seats on January 3rd of next year is going to be overwhelmingly Democratic. It's possible even the Senate could go blue as well. I've heard from some folks here in Washington that claim to have some knowledge that the Democrats already have a cohorted plan that they're just going to do investigation after investigation, probably impeachment series, whatever, to completely hamstring President Trump and the Democrat or the Republicans through the next 2 years heading into 2028. That's apparently their plan. So when you have this political dysfunction, which is going to just keep President Trump on the defensive the whole time, at the same time that we have, if this goes back into kinetic and we have a severe economic strain on us, what concerns do you have about the viability and the stability of the United States domestically?
It cost the Jewish Zionist power structure in the United States an estimated $37 million to expel Thomas Massie from office. Now, what will it cost them to retain control of enough of the House and the Senate to prevent Donald Trump's removal from office? I don't know. But if it costs $37 million to expel just one member, and they have a lot of money. I mean, there are pots of money that they have been accumulating out there, and I'm talking about this Zionist Jewish power structure involving hundreds of millions of dollars that could be applied with the goal of preventing Donald Trump from being removed so that they can retain control of the United States government. Now, they've already got it at this point because we know that 80% of the House and the Senate is effectively paid by the lobby to do what it wants. So that's a fact. You just run through, look at the amounts of money that go in there. And it's amazing. Sometimes it's a lot of money and sometimes it's not that much. But members are so greedy for money and so desperate for money to stay in office that they'll do almost anything to keep it. So I guess my assumption is that this election is probably not going to go well for Trump in particular. But the real issue is, what about this lobby? Can it retain control? That, I think it has a shot at doing so. I wouldn't write it off yet. Now, of course, that could change if the financial system crashes between now and November, and that's not an impossibility. I mean, if you listen to Ray Dalio and others, they'll say it could very easily happen. So I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. Can't know with precision when this sort of thing happens, but that could. Now, when you talk about domestic tranquility, remember we have over 50 million people inside the United States right now who are not born here. How many of those are illegal? How many of those are legal? I don't know what the exact breakdown is, but normally the numbers that you get from the federal government, depending on the administration, are lies. They're not true. So I think we have tens of millions of illegals in the country. What will most of them do? And I think it depends. It also depends on people that hold U.S. citizenship, but frankly, they're only nominally Americans. I mean, they sort of sit there and say, I'm an American. Okay. What makes you American? Well, I have citizenship. Well, popcorn, candy, citizenship. Take your pick. It's not that difficult to acquire, frankly. Not for anybody with any kind of money or influence. It's tougher for somebody without any. And a lot of people have worked very hard to get that citizenship, which is one of the reasons they're angry about illegal immigration. But my point is, we don't know how lots of groups will react. Some groups can go back to where they came from, at least until things here calm down. Other groups have nothing to go back to. And then you have the question of the rule of law. Where do we stand on that right now? How many police or policemen have left the service because they're afraid to do their jobs. They're afraid that if they do their jobs, they'll end up in front of a judge, and this judge is going to castigate them and ultimately crucify them and put them in jail when what they did was their job. How do you fix these things? Remember, if we go back to 2016, these are the things that Donald Trump was elected to do. It didn't work out very well for him because he didn't know what he was doing during his first term. Then there was the hope that if he got a second term, or in this case, the term that comes after Biden, that he may have learned something and got something right. We discovered this time around he's not even in control. He doesn't govern. It's the lobby that governs. So what could happen? I think everything from outright social disintegration, societal disintegration into chaos, to mild unrest in all of the nation's big cities, because it's in the cities that are concentrated two kinds of people. Very high end income people, not very many, but a lot. And then at the other end, large numbers of people who have nothing. And if they can't get what they need to survive and they already have nothing, they tend to be reckless. So I can't go into any greater detail, but I think we have to accept the fact that none of this is good news. And it makes you wonder just how completely out of touch everybody in Washington is. And every time I visit the place and I talk to people, I think they're living in somewhere along the line of the 1960s or the late 80s, early 90s. They're not living in the world that is America today.
So one of the things I worry about that very thing, because it's unknown, but it's almost certainly going to be bad if we go down this path, which we seem to be heading down. And the amount of time I have left with you, I want to shift gears over to the Russia-Ukraine war, because there's some continuing developments that are going on over there, which is not good for the Ukraine side. But I think we talked last time you were on that Ukraine has now effectively run out of interceptor missiles, even if they weren't that effective. Even when they're all functioning. Now they don't even have them to function at all, which means the skies are just wide open to whatever Russia wants to do. But as you were talking about before we went on the air here, there's also another development on the Russian side, which could have some impact on what could come next. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about this comment that Gerasimov, their chief of their general staff, is coming to the end of his, I think, an extended term that he had already. According to Russian law, he's not going to be able to. Might they replace him with somebody who had a different mindset?
Well, before we leave completely the war zone, we need to understand that very recently the Ukrainians successfully launched an estimated 800 unmanned systems, drones, that had been supplied by the British. The British incorporated new engines that gave them greater range, also a little bit more speed, making them harder to shoot down. So you're talking about essentially cruise missiles that fly about 20 feet above the treetops. They fly very fast. They came in great numbers. They struck targets in Moscow as well as Volgograd. I've forgotten the third city, but the point is they did a lot of damage. Now, is this damage going to stop Russia in its tracks? No. Is it going to make life harder for the average Russian? Not really. But it was a very disturbing event because you're talking about large numbers of these weapons penetrating air defenses simply because the radars couldn't pick them up. And when they did pick them up, it was too late. They had already passed. But remember, these things came largely from Great Britain. And this goes back to the other issue that we discussed a few weeks ago, which is how much longer do the Russians wait before they take action directly against the British and other states in NATO that are actively supplying this stuff to the Ukrainians. Remember, this is not going to change the outcome of the war. Ukraine is losing. It's going to continue to lose. It'll be devastated. In fact, more and more of us looking at this, and the few people left in Ukraine, less than half of what were there at the beginning, I wonder if there will even be a Ukraine on the map. That's another subject, but I think we have to take that into consideration. On the ground, we see dramatic advances towards Zaporizhzhia. We see the bridge at Zaporizhzhia, which is, I'm told, still structurally sound, but has been at least partially destroyed. Not that it makes a great deal of difference, because if anybody can throw bridges across the Dnieper River quickly and effectively, it's the Russians. And I think they can do that. So I don't think they're all that dependent on that bridge, though it's a very nice bridge and can hold a lot of weight. But I think what we're seeing is that the movement towards Odessa is very real, and it's begun. Odessa has been cut off. It's blockaded from the sea. It is no longer the artery of support and sustainment for the Ukrainians. And the Russians have actually sent in Spetsnaz and come out with lots of prisoners, some of whom I'm told are NATO officers. We don't admit to any of that, and we will not confirm any of that, but I think that's going on. So my perception is we're at the beginning of the end for Odessa, and we're seeing dramatic movement in the south. I know that the Russians are on the outskirts of Kharkov. When they plan to pull the string on that is anybody's guess. And then again, you now have, someone told me, as many as 20,000 or more North Korean troops up in Belarusia, north of Korea, along with 90 to 100,000 other Russian and Belarusian troops. Those could be hurled on very short notice south in the direction of Kiev. So the reason I bring all that up is that one thing is very clear. The Russians have at their disposal all the weapons, all the capabilities, and I would argue all the troops they need to end this war. Now, they have worried, continue to worry about a war with Europe. I mean, if you go over there, everybody I talk to goes back from Russia says the same thing. Everybody there thinks that they have to be ready for a war with Europe and NATO. They do not see us as part of that. There's still this perception that the Americans are not going to be part of that. We're just dealing with a European threat. Well, Dan, if that's true, there's no threat. And that's what everybody keeps trying to tell them. Maybe President Putin is realizing this finally, that the threat that he was worried about is not really there militarily. And then, of course, you have the Merz government, which is on life support. It's clinging to power with its fingernails. Macron is in equally bad shape, and the situation in Great Britain is more than just explosive. And if you can get David Betts to come on and talk to you about the conditions inside Great Britain for civil unrest and open rebellion, please bring him on, because his work is arguably some of the best I've seen anywhere on the general question of what do societies do. And everyone in that part of the world has had enough with millions of young men from the North Africa and the Middle East pouring into the country, raping, pillaging, committing crimes. It's unacceptable. They want them out. And I think that if you combine that with the economic damage, it's a recipe for destruction. And so maybe that's what I figured that out. Now, to go to your last point, okay. Gerasimov was given a 5-year extension 5 years ago. Technically, he's 70. He's got to leave. Now, can President Putin say, I don't care, and ask Parliament to pass some legislation that allows him to stay longer? I suppose he could. However, there's a lot of discontent with Gerasimov. Gerasimov is seen as sort of the toad in the road, someone who has obstructed badly needed change in the conduct of operations, someone who has exercised more than just caution, but has been downright timid. There is a lot of support for someone else to take over. Now, there are no rumors, but remember we mentioned Surovikin, who came out of nowhere, out of Africa after several years, had a big meeting with President Putin, and he was decorated, and it was a harmonious love fest. And then Surovikin disappeared. Nowhere to be found. There are people hoping that he may be the mystery chief of staff that comes out of nowhere, because everybody knows he's far more aggressive and is absolutely determined to end this war as rapidly as possible. Gerasimov has also jailed at least one major general who had the audacity to stand up and contradict him and criticize his conduct of things. And Gerasimov put him in jail, and to Putin's shame, according to many people, Putin has let the man languish there. That may change. I don't know. Russia is a place where, and I think it's Jim Jatras that you've had on your show. He says to me all the time, Russia is a place where what you expect doesn't ever happen, and what you never expected does. So that should set us all up for failure as prophets.